I've always stressed, like in our program and in my classes, I've always stressed the importance of reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Those standard sort of CMM questions of, what are we making? How are we making it?
Mm-hmm.
How do we make it better?
Yeah.
The notion of developing your capacity for mindfulness, in the moment mindfulness is so dependent upon reflection that, for me, reflection becomes a critical leadership practice for people.
Hello and welcome. I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me as we return to a previously recorded conversation, which was originally released in July of 2023 with Mike Hemphill, as we take a communication perspective on communication, mindfulness, and leadership. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So, whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Mike Hemphill. Mike is the Director of Leadership Development for the Clinton Foundation and co-directs the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program. He is also a professor of practice at the Clinton School of Public Service, where he teaches courses on communication and the leadership of social change. This conversation kicks off a new theme of engagement. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the conversations that are part of this month and what I wanted to call this theme. I was kind of stumped for a while. We're going to explore a lot to do with communities, participative democracy, DEI work, and I just felt like the best way to sum it all up in one word, which is a huge challenge for me, by the way, was engagement. So when I say engagement, I want you to think about multiple dimensions of the word. In this series, we're going to talk about interpersonal relationships and how we engage with each other there. We'll talk about community engagement and what we want to create together, and also engagement in larger efforts of participating in democracy, which is really also a question of what we want to create. I imagine you might also have a few other dimensions in your mind as well. I'm happy to be resharing this conversation, which was, like I said, originally published in July 2023 because, well, as I found with all the episodes I've reposted this year, this is still incredibly relevant, and I have found it really meaningful to return to these conversations and listen to them in a new context, and I'm thinking that you will find that to be true for yourself as well. Before we jump in, I want to ask for your help on something. Ask you to complete a short survey for me, which I have linked in the show notes. This is a survey that is going to help me as I begin to think about what the next year and the next season of the podcast will look like. In the interest of being truly CMM-ish, I want to co-create this space with you and continue to keep this as a dialogue. So in order for that to happen, I need to hear from you. I want to know how you're using the podcast, what you're getting out of it, what you hope to be getting out of it. Anything you'd like to share, I would like to hear. So again, there is a link in the show notes to a short survey that you can take, and I'll really appreciate you participating in co-creating this podcast. But for now, let's jump into the conversation with Mike. Hi, Mike. Thanks so much for being here today.
Hi, Abbie. Thank you for inviting me. I really am excited about the conversation we're going to have today.
Awesome. Before we jump into our conversation, I'm wondering if you can give me and my listeners a little introduction to who you are. And I'm always keeping in mind that I know you can't hit on all of the most important facets or everything about your life, so don't feel like you have to cover it all. But I just wonder what you would share that you think might be important for people to know about you as we go into this conversation together.
Sure. Well, I've spent most of my career was spent in higher ed, and I've been a student of communication basically my entire life, it feels like. But I was 24 years as a faculty member and a department chair and a dean at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and in the Department of Communication. And and then spent a couple of years at the Clinton School of Public Service, which when it first opened up in 2005, where I was a faculty member and an academic dean there, teaching communication and leadership and conflict. Taught a course that I called Conflict Transformation. And then spent some years in Shreveport, Louisiana, 4 years at Centenary College, an outstanding liberal arts college. I was provost there. And then I came back to Little Rock in 2014 to help build, and now I co-direct a national leadership program that the Clinton Foundation runs in partnership with the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, Texas. But everything about my career has been organized and focused around communication in the study of human interaction, and more from what we used to in the old days call an applied perspective, which was the interest was always in how we got things done with communication. And did my graduate work at the University of Iowa, and so that's been the focus of my work. And then tried to, in my career, follow in the scholar practitioner tradition. So I was very fortunate all those years I was at Arkansas Little Rock. The university had a very strong metropolitan mission. And so the focus was on, how we export our expertise to the community and to help the community face the challenges that it was facing. And I just loved that aspect of the work that we did. And so it was really more about putting our knowledge and our ideas to work to see how they worked, and sort of exposing students to that, which was always really exciting.
I see myself as kind of working in the same way. I like how you put that of, maybe having one foot in the door of the scholarly world and one foot in the door of the practicing side of things. And that's where I hope for this podcast to kind of exist, because why should, all of these incredibly helpful tools and the language and the ideas of a theory like CMM only exist to work in theory when it could be put into practice in a way that, helps real people in their real lives and their real relationship and their real communicating. And so I'm curious, maybe, as we keep talking, to hear more about that journey or what that transition or the balancing of both of those has been like for you, of existing in, academia and also out in the practicing world.
It's funny you say that. It reminds me of an experience I had when I was in graduate school. I think it was in my third year at the University of Iowa, and we'd invited in a really, really major name in our field, a communication theorist. And I got in an argument, and he came in as a guest, sort of did a visiting lecture thing in a seminar we were having. And I got into an argument with him, and it was one of those situations where it was like, halfway into it, I realized, I'm arguing with this guy. It's like, what are you doing? I mean, what are you thinking? But he was so adamant about, communication theorists should focus on theory, and it's somebody else's responsibility to take that and apply it in some meaningful way. And I kept challenging him on, why can't you do both? Why can't you, as you think about this, why can't you test it in the real world and then let people know how it worked out? And he got really upset with me. And I just finally decided, well, I should probably let it go. And so I did. But
it feels like a natural step to me to go from theory to practice. And I think it's unreasonable to expect that people outside of academia or outside of the world of theory, people that, are not like us and did not dedicate all of their studies to communication, that how are they supposed to access it if the people who have some connection to, that theory aren't able to at least help with, and I see it as like translating it, not that it's an entirely different language, but translating it in a way to make it accessible to people that don't have that same foundation, I guess.
Yeah. And, and I do think, as I look back on that, and that was that's grad school was a long time ago. So we're talking 1978. But even back then, like in my area of organizational communication, there was such a hard effort to legitimize the discipline of communication, because for so long, and even still today, it is seen by a lot of people as an art, not a science. And I think part of that establishing itself as a discipline was taking a hard line on things like, we're going to have people who theorize about how communication happens, and And it's up to other people, like technicians, take scientific theory and apply it to real world situations. Other people need to take this and apply it. It was actually one of the things that really excited me when I first started studying CMM, when I first met Barnett Pierce and Kim Pierce, to see the way in which they had framed their work around, grounding their ideas in the practical application of them. And it seemed like it was such a powerful approach to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a good point where I'm just curious about your perspective on how you define communication, because I have in my head maybe an idea of when I say, this is a podcast about communication, or I'm talking about communication. I study communication. I have a communication perspective. I have in my head some ideas of what that means, but I think it's so expansive. And I just want to keep finding new ways to put it into, again, more accessible language for people. So I'm just curious, after, all your years of experience, what has that added up to be how you would define communication now, or how you understand it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about, I go all the way back to when I was a kid. And I grew up in a I'm sure there's a term for it, but I grew up in a highly verbal storytelling family.
Yeah.
And so when I was a kid, I was the youngest of 4 kids, but my mom and dad, my brother and 2 sisters and I would sit down every evening for dinner. And our dinners would last anywhere from 30, 45 minutes to, we could go 2.5 hours, just engaged in conversation. A lot of times it was like what we did during the day, or something somebody read, or my dad, politics, or whatever it might be. And it was always my sister Mary Lou and I trying to make each other laugh, and or some of us getting mad or getting angry and arguing over particular ideas or whatever it was. I mean, we were always engaged in that. And it was to the point that when I would have friends come over and spend the night, a lot of my friends were like super intimidated. They couldn't believe my family was so
yeah.
And I'd go to their house and couldn't believe they would eat dinner and not say a word while they were eating. It just seems so odd to me. But and I think this reveals more about me and what a huge nerd I must have been when I was a kid. I remember really thinking about meaning.
Yeah.
About how meaning happens. And I was really, for a long time, really focused on the privacy of our thoughts. And the idea that other people have no idea what I'm thinking. And conversely, I have no idea what other people are thinking, but that somehow with that given, we manage to communicate with one another where we can develop this shared understanding. And so, I've always thought about that. And even when I think about getting into college and majored in communication, that's the thing I was most interested in, is like answering the question is, where does meaning come from? And it seems to me that in a lot of approaches to communication, meaning is the most mysterious thing, but it's the thing that is just accepted as a given in most treatments of communication, and that it is. And so you give that, and then you're worried about everything else. The other thing, and I feel like I'm not answering your question, but I'm getting to it, I think.
Yeah, it's all a part of it. I understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other thing for me is the history of the reification of communication, treating the process of communication as if it's a real thing.
Yeah.
And for some people, it's like we talk about treating meaning as if it's a commodity that you give this, you transfer from yourself to somebody else.
Right.
And there's a lot of paradigms that are based on that metaphor of a commodity exchange. Early in my teaching career, again, long ago, when we used to show films, not videotapes. This is before we didn't have videotapes back, but we showed films. And one of the films we had an animated model of communication. And it was these 2 cartoon heads with each other, with an airplane inside the head of one person, where these people were loading boxes into the plane, flying out the mouth of, I'm not making this up, flying out the mouth of the one character and into the ears of the other, where they would then unload the boxes. And this was this was their way of representing, this is what happens in the communication process. Highly disturbing image when you watched it. It was like, I don't think I want to do that, right. That kind of thing. But But there's a strong gravitational pull towards that idea that meaning is reified and is real. And so I see a good portion of my early career in communication, that's what I was trained in, this kind of positivistic causal notion of, if you do X in the construction of a message, then Y will happen. Mm-hmm. And wanting to believe that was tangible like that. There was a systems researcher theorist by the name of Berrien, who used to talk about systems as clouds. Mm-hmm. And that and talking about the boundaries of systems, that they're like clouds when you're in an airplane, and that when you're outside of the system and when you're inside the system, but you really can't. It's real fuzzy where the boundary is, right? When you're in a
interesting
communication is I think about communication in the same way. And so we know that there's something cognitive that happens when people communicate, and we know that it generates, that our words and our behaviors and the experience generates within us information, feelings that influence our behaviors in ways that we're able to get things done. See, there's that background of mine of how we look at communication as ways of getting things done.
Yeah.
And that the evidence of effective communication then is the clues that our experience give us that in fact we do have a shared understanding with someone. So you and I see something, you and I, go to a movie and we see a movie and we both cry at the movie. Then we have a sort of experiential data there that suggests that at some level it resonated emotionally with us in a similar way. Mm-hmm. And for me, the communication process is just that process of sharing clues and reading the tea leaves of our behaviors to suggest how well those clues have been interpreted.
Yeah, I am really resonating with everything you're saying about your experience with communication and kind of this, if this is said or if this communication happens, then this outcome is made. Because I think before I even started formally studying communication, I was aware, or, upon reflection, I become even more aware that I would say my high school self got really good at understanding and maybe seeing some of these patterns of, if I act this way, then people respond to me in this way. Always, I'm trying to act in a way where people respond favorably to me when I'm in a leadership position, when I'm in a classroom position. And one example I can think that, maybe demonstrates kind of the even nuance level at which I was obsessing about this is when I'm in the classroom, I'm balancing this perception of, I don't want my classmates to see me as too much of a nerd or a teacher's pet. So I'm kind of balancing this. I want to seem cool to them, but I also do want to be the teacher's favorite person. And I want to be smart and I feel smart and I want that to be shown. I'm kind of these two very different perceptions of me trying to balance in the same world of a classroom. And I think that was probably not healthy to the extent that I would say I had kind of an obsessive relationship to that. And that I would say came out through people pleasing. Mm-hmm. I still had this understanding of communication, whether I would call it that or not at the time, but communication as this force that I had control over. I knew that I was communicating something about myself. And I ask what your definition of communication is. And I want to ask everybody what their definition of communication is, because I feel like I need help making mine more succinct. Because in my eyes, I'm communicating is living. Living is communicating. When I say I did communication studies, I feel like I'm saying I did human being studies, because you're communicating every moment verbally. Yes. But, where you spend your money communicates something, where you spend your time communicates something, the language you use is communicating something about you. And so I just see, and I'm continuing to try to see everything through this lens of communication in my life. And it just seems so far reaching to me. The more I get into it, I see even more nuance and even more layers. But the meaning too is really crucial to me. And it is interesting that you say that a lot of theories kind of take it for granted, but that's one of the most compelling parts of CMM for me, and helpful in my own life. Helpful not just in a theoretical way, but in a practical way, that I now go out into the world and have this, kind of lens on of what meaning am I making? And I'm reflecting on myself, and I'm asking, is that
serving me that I see it that way? What if I saw it in a different way? And just going through that practice to me is incredibly helpful. And that's kind of what I'm like, how do I get that into the hands of more people?
I keep coming back to for me personally, I've always come back to the notion of sort of this paradigm that we're so steeped in with communication as communication as a means to an end.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and there's so many of these moments of working with CMM, and I've had so many aha moments.
Yeah.
But for me, one of the important ones was thinking about the whole notion of coordination and coherence.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point in one of his book chapters, Barnett, uses the example of dance as, a coordinated act, and he says something really important there that it's easy to gloss over. That all dance is coordinated behavior, right? It's just that some people are more coordinated at it than others.
Right.
And so in a way, the dance is the given part. And so when I think about communication, I don't think about what it is we do, what do we say, or I think more about the coordination in the coherence element, that as social human beings, we necessarily coordinate our behavior with one another. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, we also have to impose some coherence to it in some way. And to me, that's the focus. I mean, so when you ask, what's my definition of communication? I would say that it is anything and everything that contributes to the coordinated or impacts the coordinated behavior among people and provides them the mechanism by which they cohere those actions in a way that's meaningful for them. And so it almost flips it. In my mind, it almost flips the way you think about communication.
Right.
Like when I was teaching public speaking, you look at the speech, the public presentation as the means to the end of getting the audience, to persuade the audience, as opposed to thinking in terms of I'm in a situation right now where me and a group of people are going to come to some coordinated position on something, and there are a number of ways in which we can influence that coordinated behavior. Yeah. I mean, there are the frameworks that we create, the way I've organized my message, what sometimes we call the scaffolding that we use to construct that message. There's the responses from the audience. There's the things I do in the moment will open up the conversation in particular ways, all of which will generate the world that we're making while we're in that process. And there's something else about that, Abbie, that I came to a realization a long time ago. For my students, I used to refer to it as the illusion of stability. Uh-huh. And I've used this idea, especially when I was teaching in courses in conflict, and why we resist change. And the whole idea was that even though we were presented with, and I think all of us understand that we live in a very dynamic environment, things are changing all the time.
Yeah.
That's overwhelming if you really stop to contemplate all the ways in which your world is changing.
Yeah.
And so we have a tendency to create this symbolic illusion of stability to convince ourselves that things aren't changing as much as they really are, because that's the story we tell ourselves to help us move forward in the day. Otherwise, you're just completely overwhelmed with the reality that's around you. And I see communication in the same way. I mean, there is a certain illusion that we create about the process.
Yeah.
You have to sort of talk about it in static ways because we haven't developed the capacity to really understand it in its dynamic sense.
Yeah.
Even when you're speaking authentically about communication, you're relying on these illusions that we create about the process.
I guess I would say I'm an advocate then for communication's sake, and almost of like, yeah, you can say, okay, well, I want to persuade this audience of this. If you're thinking public communication, and you could, do if X, then Y, and, try to follow this formula that makes communication feel really static and, something that you can hold in the palm of your hand when it really is this dynamic thing. And so I feel like, CMM frames it as communication and bettering your communication in the interest of creating a better social world and, communication being a means to that end. And I feel like that is a helpful way to frame it, that then, all of these other things can fall into place behind that. But for me, communication for communication's own sake, the benefits kind of come on their own, I think, if you take that perspective, at least for me.
No, I think you're right. I think, this last fall, I taught a graduate course I was back at the Clinton School.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a course on communication and the leadership of social change. And we were actually using Arthur Jensen's and Rob Penman's books on cosmopolitan communication.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a really good example of the sort of thing I'm talking about, because we were at one point in the class, we were talking about the different contexts, cultural context and relational context and episode, the context of episode. And so the question naturally arises of, well, how do you define the episode? As if there was some resource we could go to, or measuring stick we could apply that says in this conversation or in this day's worth of interactions, here were the different episodes that occurred. And so I would share with my students is that's not really the point. The point isn't that we can objectively identify what the episodes are. The real point is do you understand that we have a tendency to punctuate our interactions in ways that can be defined as episodes. And the real thing is in the moment, can you develop the capacity within yourself to where in the moment, you recognize it as an episode and you're curious about whether the other person recognizes it as an episode, or in what different ways what the nuances of it are, or what does it mean when you do and they don't? And that's the insights. That's what moves the shared understanding forward. That's what contributes to the making of the social world that we're talking about, is that we're thinking about things in that particular way. I'm just making me think of something else too. In small group communication, you'd get 10 different textbooks, and the textbooks in small group communication would always have at the very beginning, the very first chapter was how many people constitute a small group.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember articles written where people had really big arguments about this.
Yeah.
No more than 5, no more than 7, 9, and all with really good reasons. And then I can't remember who it was, but I remember I got a textbook to review, and I used it because in the first chapter, they said, numbers don't matter with a small group, that a small group is made up of any collection of people who all believe they're members of the same small group. And I thought, yeah, exactly. That it's just that the identification of the small group is in and of itself this illusion, this artificial symbolic put on it, and it can obscure if we if we focus all of our attention on that artificial symbolic illusion, then we're losing all of the attention that we should be placing to what's actually happening while we're in the moment. As you were saying, what's happening when we treat communication for communication's sake.
Yeah, that's good. I'm curious about how your experience of teaching communication has deepened your understanding compared to when you were a student of communication.
Oh, interesting. Well, probably in 2 ways. I still do. I love teaching. And there's just something about the classroom. And it was because of the teachers that I had. It's interesting. I started by saying, I grew up in a family that were storytellers. And then the most important teachers I had in college when I was an undergraduate, people like Jerry Butler and Alan Ward and Steve Runnebaum and Wayne Chapman, they all taught us with stories. Yeah. It was never the case that they came into class and went through their lecture notes for the day. It was like they came into class with their lecture notes, but every class was sort of like, let's just see where this goes. Let's just take this where you all want to take it. And so I learned from them, and that's always the way I approached my classes. or I tried to at least. And I can remember walking out of some of my classes where I took 4 or 5 pages of lecture notes in and didn't get halfway down the first page because the conversation, you sort of went where the conversation went. But the reason I'm sharing that with you is because what that enabled for me as a teacher is I learned a lot from my students, because it wasn't just because I think I was willing to share experiences with them that I had had. They were willing to do the same. And so I heard different and saw the different ways in which people approached the communication challenges. And it gave me different and I think, better insights. I want to tell you this story real quickly about teaching public speaking. So this was very early in my career, but for most of my career, I taught a required first-year communication course. Every student in the university had to take it to graduate. And there's a public speaking component to it. And so it was that in and of itself, I loved that challenge, right? I loved the challenge of having students that were only there because they were forced to be there in their minds and didn't want to be there anyway because Hemphill's going to make us give a speech.
Yep.
Early on in my career, I'm teaching this class. It comes time for our speeches, and I always use the system where I'd let students volunteer, but if there's a slightest hesitation, I had a list ready, and I would just name somebody on the list. And so I did that one. I named this young man, and he walks up to the front of the room, and I notice he's carrying a brown paper grocery bag, not a plastic. We didn't have plastic. It was one of those, large brown. He goes up in front of the class. He looks at all of us. He has the bag in one hand. You whap. He opens. He kind of slings it and opens it up, and he puts it on his head. And it's just the bag. There's nothing, no eye holes cut out, no mouth hole cut out.
Okay.
And as I say that, and I'm sharing this with you, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, that seems odd. But in the context of our class where we talked about attention getters and everybody's doing creative things. And so I just thought, like the rest of the class, I'm sure thought, well, this is his attention getter. Mm-hmm. And it was about 2 minutes into his speech. And I could see it sitting in the back of the class. I could see it just kind of pass through the whole room as everybody realized, including me, he's not taking the bag off his head. And so for 7 minutes, he gives this speech with this bag on his head and no eye holes, no mouth hole, which meant for 7 minutes, all we heard was, didn't hear anything. Yeah. You couldn't hear anything he was saying. He gets to the end and it's like, and he stops and he pulls the bag off his head and he's perspiring. His face is all flushed. It's just, in looking back on it at some point, as the instructor, I probably should have stopped him. Yeah. But I for whatever reason, I didn't. Mm-hmm. Still, this is the other great thing. And anybody out there that's taught public speaking in that kind of environment will understand this. Pulls the bag off. The class just gave him a great round of applause. Had no idea what he was talking about. Yeah. Nothing about nothing. So after class, I had him come over to me and I just said, man, what was that? And he was he just said, I'm terrified of giving speeches. And it's knowing that people are looking at me and it makes me so nervous. Mm. And then he said to me, he said, it looked pretty stupid, didn't it? And I didn't know what to say. I said, well, now that I've seen it, it looked pretty silly.
Now that you mention it, yes.
Yeah. I wouldn't have known before.
You brought it up.
Yeah. So what I told him was, you're always looking for a teaching moment. I said, well, isn't that interesting that in communication, oftentimes the harder we work to keep something from happening, like in our relationships in particular, that whatever it is we're doing to make it not happen is actually making it happen. You get the complete opposite result. And he was kind of looking at me. I said, so you didn't quite understand. And I said, so what gives you the most concern? He said, well, people looking at me. And I said, what's the one thing you made sure of when you put that bag on your head? And he said, oh, yeah, everybody was looking at me. And I said, exactly. Yeah. And so I worked with him over the next week and he came back and gave his speech without the bag on his head and everything was fine. But there were those kind of moments where I learned a lot about communication from the way in which my students approached it and in the way they shared it with the group. And so it was always, my lectures were always me amplifying the ideas we were talking about by sharing stories, mainly from my personal life. I would tell so many stories about my brother and my sisters. One of the constant evaluations I would get from students at the end of a semester was that, there weren't any questions about Hemphill's brother, Tom, on the test. And
that's funny.
Yeah.
They're like, I've been taking notes all this time on the family dynamics.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
That's funny. You're making me think one of the illusions of communication is that it's taken for granted that we'll just stumble into effective communication in our lives.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I'm connecting that even to, I know what is, not unique to that story you just told, but a really broad fear of public speaking or, public communicating in that way that maybe in some ways trickles down to even interpersonal communication. But I wonder if, part of that fear comes from this unspoken expectation that you just should know how to do it. Maybe we wouldn't be so afraid of communicating, which I think is a vulnerable act. So I think that's where some of that fear comes. But maybe that fear would be lessened if everybody came into it with like, all right, we're going to figure this out. We're all actually starting from zero. We're not kidding ourselves by thinking that we're already at 99%.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. In a very flippant way with absolutely no basis in any research whatsoever. I used to tell my students that, so when you're a communication professor and you're doing public speaking, I always worried about even bringing up communication anxiety. Mm-hmm. Because I thought there's a certain number of my students who weren't nervous about speaking suddenly would be because I'm talking. Mm-hmm. It's like, wait a minute, I should be nervous about this. I would tell my students, I think a big part of it is when you learn to communicate. I mean, when you start interacting with the world around you and start noticing responses and you're cognizant of that, right? That age of 3 or 4, whatever. So just think about it, how exciting that must be. That has to be one of the most exciting moments of our entire existence is when and yet everybody's reaction to it is basically to tell us to shut up. Mm. And so I'm around adults with little kids who are just learning to talk. They spend more time, not now, daddy's talking, don't interrupt. And it's like, no. And then you go to school and, you can't talk unless you raise your hand first. And I always loved going to when we would go to friends' houses that had kids that were in elementary school and you'd be at the dinner table or whatever, and they're raising their hands at home to,
yeah.
And then you get into school in the communication class and suddenly somebody says, okay, now you can talk, get up and say something to everybody. I do think you're right. I think there is that kind of expectation, going back, got this kid with the grocery sack on his head. I've used that example. I use that example in my classes all the time after that happened. Eye contact in public speaking is a good example of I think what we're talking about, which is it's something that makes people really, really nervous. Although I always noticed my students in the student union with their friends talking about what they did the previous weekend were leaning into their conversation, looking at each other, smiling, all animated. I mean, it's not as if it's a skill we don't know how to use, but in that context of public speaking. But I would then challenge my students, why do you look? Why do we want you to look at the members of the audience? And what's interesting is that oftentimes they feel that it's a persuasive technique. Yeah. So a lot of people think, so if you look at the audience and the audience, perceives you as being authentic and sincere, and that makes you more influential in your message. And isn't that fascinating? Because it suggests then that communication is something we do to the audience. And so now we're back in that causal thing. Instead, what I would tell them is instead think about, as you're giving your speech, you want to be able to modify your message, just like you do in a lot of your interpersonal conversations. You want to modify your message based on the reaction you're getting from the audience. You look at your audience because you can tell when you've said something they don't quite understand. And so you need to elaborate a little bit more on that. Mm-hmm. You are letting them, we use a CMM idea. You're letting your audience co-author the presentation that you're giving.
Yep.
And so you don't memorize a speech. You don't read it from a manuscript. You know what it is you want. You organize things. You think about word choice, but then you let it. Then you make that speech literally with the audience and you can't do that if you're not looking at the audience. The most absurd example of this, when I was in junior high, I had a speech teacher tell us that if it bothers you to look in people's eyes, then just look at their eyebrows instead.
Yeah.
Right? Because he said they can't tell. They think you're looking at them in their eyes, as if that was a trick you're playing on the audience. I want to make you think I care, so I'm going to look at you in your eyes.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm looking at your eyebrows. And I don't know if you've ever done that before, but if you do, I guarantee you there comes a point where whatever it is you're talking about, you get distracted because you start thinking, eyebrows are really weird, really a weird part of the facial anatomy. I mean, they're really hard. Look at people, because in a public speaking context that I'm talking about, that's one of the ways we invite them into the conversation that we're having with them.
Absolutely. I'm seeing it as like, if you're like, oh, well, just look at their eyebrows, or, oh, well, we make eye contact to, persuade people or something. It's like a shallow version of what I see, communication as being this like really rich thing of like, no, you make eye contact with someone to, like you said, it's an invitation. It's a connection on this like human level of I'm seeing you, you're seeing me, there's nowhere to hide. And to me, I'm like, that's, compelling again is the only word I have to use. But it's like, that's why I enjoy studying and considering communication, is because it unlocks a world that's really rich to me. I'm not looking at it because it's this surface level thing of how to control people or influence people, which that again comes with it. But it's like, there's a difference between, again, communication for communication's sake and, influence, positive relationships, effective communication being byproducts of those things. I think that's different than, communication in order to specifically try to get those things. Like you kind of have to pretend like you don't want them maybe.
Mm-hmm. So how much of that do you think is this richness that you're talking about? How much of this is a result of the challenge of trying to understand what's really a very complex process? I mean, I wonder sometimes, do you think that when confronted with those kinds of complex processes, we opt for a overly simplistic explanation of it?
Yeah. I know I probably can't speak for everybody, because like there is nothing more that I love than like really looking into something complex and, almost like it's a game to me of like, let me try to find the best words to express this. Or, again, communication goes so much more beyond the verbals, but what is the body language I'm using? What are the themes we're talking about? What's the context we're considering? To me, that's like such a worthwhile thing to spend my mental energy on and spend my time considering and studying. To me, it's rewarding to look into that. But I know, one of the criticisms of CMM is that it's so complex or feels, convoluted. But my response to that is the world is so complex. And so if CMM is going to do even a fraction of translating that or making sense of it, making meaning of it, then CMM also does have to be complex. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it's going to take a little extra energy to break it down for ourselves or to make it real for us, to put it into practice for ourselves.
I think something we should mention at this juncture too is, at the same time, we have to recognize that an approach like CMM is not the approach.
Yeah.
And in fact, a cosmopolitan approach to communication must include an understanding of the interactants that a cosmopolitan perspective is not the perspective.
Yeah.
Because what we recognize is there are different modes of communicating. And, I think the example that comes to my mind is in my career, as I tried to use CMM in the way that I taught and the way that I interacted with my colleagues, and certainly in my personal life, the way I handled my administrative responsibilities when I was in higher ed administration. And there's a mindfulness that's involved in that. And there's a willingness to understand the different stories that people bring into all the situations you're dealing with. Barnett actually helped me. And I can still remember having this conversation with him when I was facing some really critical administrative challenges, trying to hear all voices, right? Bring everybody into the conversation. And at some point he stopped me and he said, Mike, this is all well and good, but at some point you got to make a decision. I mean, it's like, you can be in a perpetual state of mindfulness trying to get the more complete story.
Yeah.
Let's make a decision and move on. Sure, that's what you should do. And so one of the things we've learned, like in the program I'm co-directing right now, our Presidential Leadership Scholars Program, and we talk about leadership development, and we look at examples from these 4 presidential administrations and the leadership challenges that were faced there. And we hear from members of their administrations. And in the case of President Clinton and President Bush, we hear from them, and they both share the same perspective with us, which is when you're facing a key decision, you invite smart people into the room and you debate and you collect information. But as President Bush says frequently, at some point you got to make the decision.
Yeah. To
What they both share with us is the attitude that when you make that decision, not thinking, well, that's it. We don't have to make that. We don't have to deal with that issue anymore. You make this decision to set up the next decision that's going to have to be made with this. And I think that's where, it's one of the challenges I think for people who are trying to understand CMM. I found that with the students that I've had, like in this last semester, this course I taught, for the longest time, there was this undercurrent of, okay, I'm grasping this, I'm getting this idea, but what am I supposed to do? We're talking about communication and leadership, and we're looking at it from a CMM perspective. Okay, I get it conceptually, but tell me, what do I do when I'm in this situation?
Right.
And I kept telling my students, it's what I'm hoping is by the end of the semester, you recognize that's not the question you want to be asking.
Right.
It's not prescriptive in that way.
Yeah. And
that it becomes a part of a broader repertoire of communication competencies that you bring into every conversation.
Yeah. I love to talk about a communication perspective or a communication lens, just because that makes sense to me. And I really do visualize it as like, you go to the eye doctor and they're like 1 or 2. 1 or 2,
right.
2 or 3, and they're showing you these different lenses, and it's changing what you're seeing. The thing on the other side is not necessarily changing, but the way that you're seeing it through the lens is changing. And so CMM is one of countless lenses or frameworks, I would say, to approach the world, to see the world through. So it's like you're putting on a different pair of glasses, and maybe one moment calls for a CMM perspective, so you put on, quote unquote, your CMM glasses.
Right.
And in another moment, a different perspective is more beneficial to use. But it's like different glasses. You have a tool belt, and, CMM is one of the tools in that tool belt.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. Yeah. And CMM allows for that to happen. That's just baked into the perspective.
I think that's why I like it so much, is that it does feel so expansive. And that is maybe why I can slippery slope into, all I'll ever need is CMM, and that's the perfect framework for my life. Because it feels like it is helpful in so many different situations for me. But, that does not mean that there cannot be other beneficial frameworks. But I think the, beautiful thing about being guided by being CMM-ish is that it leaves its doors open to work hand in hand with so many other things. It's not CMM or this perspective, CMM or something else. It's always, trying to work hand in hand with other things. And I think it lends itself really naturally to that.
It's the both and, not the either or.
Yes.
That's a main reason why I've always stressed, like in our program and in my classes, I've always stressed the importance of reflection. Those standard sort of CMM questions of, what are we making? How are we making it? How will we make it better?
Yeah.
The notion of developing your capacity for mindfulness, in the moment mindfulness, is so dependent upon reflection that it becomes for me, it becomes reflection becomes a critical leadership practice for people. And, even going back to my public, I don't know, I was going to talk about public speaking so much on this, but I go back to my classes where I taught public speaking, where I knew my students after they finish that required assignment, would sit down and think to themselves, thank God that's over. I'm never doing that again. Right.
Yeah.
I got it over with. But, I'd always tell them, you sit down and you should think to yourself, what am I going to do differently next time? Because there will be a next time.
Right.
And how important to frame things in terms of, I want to think about, later on with CMM, I kind of rephrase the question of, what did we make?
Yeah.
So when you have those moments where you have to make the tough decision, or you have to, I've always said that the times you need to practice leadership most effectively are almost always the times you don't want to.
Yeah.
Because you have to, you have to make a tough decision, or you have to give bad news to somebody, or negative feedback to someone, or whatever it may be. And those are really, really challenging. Those are challenging moments in our lives.
You're making me think, use the language of communication is not something that we do to someone else. And I know that you've used that same kind of language around, like, leadership is not something that you do to other people.
Right.
So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, what your perspective and your experience with leadership is.
Yeah. Well, that's the starting point for me. And Kim and Barnett Pierce really helped us a lot in the early years of the Clinton School of Public Service, where we had the first master's degree in public service. And it was very reflective of the Clinton legacy of, sort of grassroots, face-to-face, community change, public service. One of the things I would tell the students is that at the Clinton School, we didn't treat public service as something that you do to somebody. It's something that emerges because of our interactions with others.
Yeah.
And in a more nuanced way, then it was one of the things that we wanted to do for them as students in our program was to give them the capacity to create the types of frameworks that would encourage the types of interactions that would lead to the sorts of changes that were beneficial to a community, depending on whether the specific issue or challenges they were facing.
Right.
And I think that carries over to this mindset of leadership in the same way, that leadership is not, and again, it's a reification. It's not something you have. It's not something you have more or less of, although we have a tendency to think of it in those terms.
Yeah.
Leadership is really the result, the process of this interaction that we have. And here, I don't know if this is going to make sense or not, but I think what's happened is that in reifying leadership, what we do is we tend to see the person. I don't know, you see if this makes sense to you. If you think about somebody that you consider to be a strong leader, or someone who exercised strong leadership in a particular situation, my sense is that almost always those are the individuals that somehow were able to influence the framework of the interaction in such a way that challenges were faced, problems were solved, things moved forward in some particular way. Now, their ability to influence those frameworks may be because of their expertise. It may be because of their charisma. It may be because of their hierarchical position in the power hierarchy of an organization. Be a lot of reasons why and it could be because they have an authentic, I think what we used to call in leadership, an authentic transformational approach to leadership, where they saw that we're in this together, and our goal is for all of us to be involved and to improve as we face these challenges. I feel that way. I feel so strongly about it that I work really, really hard to never use the word leader in our leadership program, to not refer to our participants as leaders.
Yeah.
I will every once in a while, but I really work hard not to, because I think that term suggests there's something about the individual.
Yeah, right.
That gives them that status, when that's not the case at all. And so if we look at leadership as this process, then the question shifts from what do I need to do to what do we need to do? And then looking at that process as what's generating the change, or what's helping us face those challenges. It's, in a way, and I think some of the participants in our program feel this way, it's kind of a liberating perspective. It's complicated, like you said. It's like you mentioned earlier, it's this rich, complicated, face of interaction that we're getting into, but at the same time, it lifts the responsibility from the individual. Now, going back to Barnett's advice to me, it also recognizes that in certain contexts, we need that one person to have that responsibility.
Yeah.
A number of years ago, I had a kidney stones and go to the emergency room. That's not the moment I want fourth level of mindfulness from my doctor. Just please tell me what do something.
Yeah.
Just do it. But we approach leadership as truly as, interacting with others in order to get things done. And I'm just going to share this with you real quick because it really illustrates this point. I used to say in our program that was a leadership development program in which we looked at how the quality of the interactions with others helped us to make the world a better place. And had one of our participants, when I mentioned that one time, say that, whose definition of better? And I was like, wow. I mean, that's it, right? Because oftentimes we think of leadership in the standard, look through the process.
Yeah.
And I have my end state in mind, and now I just got to get you. But there's a lot more to that saying that, leadership is about finding what direction people are going and then running ahead of them. What's overlooked in that statement oftentimes is that what leadership requires is to understand that those that you're interacting with are heading in a direction. Yeah. And it's silly to not recognize that. I used to liken leadership to parachuting onto one horse in a stampeding herd, and that the herd's on it's moving. Yeah. And you get on that one horse and you can influence and impact in some way the direction, but it really is about how are we going to approach this challenge? And it can be a real liberating perspective to take. And it gives you the entree then to take a lot of the CMM notions and bring them into and focus on the issues that you're facing in your leadership.
There's two things you're making me think. One is that everything you just said feels like a big nod back to what you were saying about the beginning about the coordination of it all, the collaboration that is innate and, you can't be denied. It's just innately a part of the communication, leadership, life. There's always that coordination. And then kind of sounds like the same conversation you're trying to have around leadership is part of what I'm trying to do around talking about creativity, because I think some people could be like, oh, I'm a creative person, or I'm just not a creative person. It's in the same way you could hear someone say, well, I'm a leader, or someone say, I'm just not a leader. I don't want to use those words in that way. Yeah, right, it's creativity is not a quality you have or you don't have. It's like up for the taking for anybody in the same way leadership is, if you're, kind of cultivating it, I guess. And I think, it's liberating. It's more expansive. It just feels like more helpful to think about those concepts in that way for it to be emerging, for it, and maybe part of why we cling to saying definitive statements about ourselves, like I'm a leader or I'm not creative, is because it goes back to that illusion of stability. Yeah. Because if you can't use that language in that way and you're like, well, sometimes I'm creative and sometimes I'm a leader, that's a little, unstable. I think we are really, drawn to who am I and what definitive statements can I make about myself? Because we want to know ourselves. We want to understand ourselves. It's why we do reflection. But that's why we're also not, okay, we did our reflection and now we're moving on. We're always reflecting and doing that work because we're always changing and there's always new things to reflect on.
You're making me think of a couple things. One is there came a point in my career where I started, like in the job hiring process, so you're a department chair and you've got a faculty position open and you post the ad and, 50 or 60 or 100 people, whatever, they apply for the job. And the standard approach then is that you go through the applications and you rate them in some way, then you rank them. And we had a system in place on our campus, like many, many other campuses, where the dean and the provost and the chancellor to give us your top three, or, but it was this sort of rank ordering thing. Yeah. And there came a point where I realized that in most job searches are conducted within the myth of the best candidate.
Yeah.
The myth that in any one pool of applicants, there is a best candidate.
Yeah.
And when you think about when you hear the conversations that have resurfaced here recently about affirmative action, and it is all based on the notion that you shouldn't do anything that interferes with the best candidate getting the job, as if we know in advance who the best candidate is. And the difference, which we sort of evolved into, which was to look at the applicant pool in terms of who are the people that are demonstrating a capacity to become a really good faculty member for us at some point.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we do the same thing in our program. Our participants are stunned to find out, you know, we have 500 to 600 applications a year for our program, and we pick 60 people. So it's a pretty competitive process.
Yeah.
They are surprised to find out that we don't rank order people and take the top 60. We really do.
Yeah.
You know, we maximize the diversity of the group at every stage of selection. And then after we've done our final interviews, we put together a lot of different groups of 60 and sort of see how they look like.
Yeah.
And then once we're done, and this is the great CMM thing, is that once we've selected a cohort, then what I challenge everybody involved in the program to do is let's make this the best cohort.
Yep.
You know, we're not picking the best people because we didn't look at it. We didn't rank them in those terms. We ranked them for their capacity to grow in their leadership. And now that we've got them, let's make this something special for this group of people. As Kim says, I've heard she used to tell our students before we go do community dialogues, our students would be really worried about, what if nobody shows up? You know, we've done all this work, what if nobody comes? And Kim would say, don't worry about it. The right people are always there.
Yeah.
You know, this is what, you know, you'll make this into the experience that it can be,
right,
with whoever is there.
Yeah. The first thing I'm thinking is that that's obviously a much more complex way to go about hiring or, you know, sifting through hundreds of applicants. But again, it is more reflective of what is equally complex of all of those human beings on the other end of those applications, you know, and those complex dynamics and their complex stories. And again, you reference their capacities that it's not coming across maybe on a resume. And so again, I think it's one of those, yes, it's more challenging, but maybe it is worth leaning into those more challenging, those more complex, those more, you know, mental or time or energy consuming things to be a more appropriate response. Because my biggest pet peeve is like the oversimplifying of complex things. I can understand why we do it because, you know, we want it to, you know, fit into the palm of our hand. And maybe that's why I'm looking for a simpler explanation or definition of communication. Sure. Because I want something to kind of hold on to. But it would also be a disservice to oversimplify.
So my wife and I are getting ready to, in 4 weeks, we have our 50th high school reunion, which doesn't even seem possible. We graduated, she and I graduated. We didn't know each other in high school, but we graduated from the same high school. And so high school reunions are really interesting to me because I'm going to see people. In fact, she was just telling me, she was looking at the list of people who are RSVP'd. And so there are people coming to this reunion that have not been to any of our other reunions.
Yeah.
So there are people that are coming to this reunion that I have not seen in 50 years. And as she's reading off the names of these people, the meanings that are being generated within me are all rooted in
50-year-old memories.
In their 18-year-old selves.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think going back to the leadership notion, this process of interacting with others, this illusion that oftentimes we put on ourselves, right? That we have to understand we also put that illusion, that symbolic static representation of other people on them.
Yeah.
Right. And we don't reckon like going to the reunion and expecting the 68-year-old to be the 18-year-old.
Yeah.
You know, it's ridiculous. Yet at the same time, it's exactly what just what your brain does.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to think who it is. I think it's Arthur Jensen in his book. There's this notion of, in this cosmopolitan perspective, is that you let, when you're in these challenging conversations, you let the emotions permeate. You don't hold on to the emotions. You don't let them fester. You don't ignore them. You just let them. And I love this vision of just let it permeate. Well, in my sense making, that's that illusion of stability, right? That is whoever that was that wrote that. When I read that, what I thought was, yeah, what you're saying is don't artificially symbolically freeze that as this emotion, anger, bad, or as don't frame it as an argument that needs a response. One of the things we talk about in our leadership program is the kind of collaborative leadership that we talk about in our program. We work at creating frameworks of interaction that allow us to understand the other person without feeling any obligation to agree with them.
Yeah.
And so this notion of letting your feelings permeate, just resist the urge to freeze it and label it as something.
Yeah.
And just stay focused on understanding. And that becomes a really critical, I think, aspect of your leadership, is your ability to do that with yourself, but to do it with other people as well. And then after these challenging leadership moments, that's one of the things you should reflect on, is how well did I do that? How well, and you might think of it as suspend judgment or however you want it, but I love that notion of just to let those emotions permeate, to let your judgment, to let your meaning permeate, means you recognize that it's there.
Yeah.
But you recognize there's more to it. There's that mystery to it. And then at some point, you are going to freeze it and label it and say, this is what it is. So we can so that we can tell the story about it later. I mean, you've got to. If we didn't, we never would tell the stories. We wouldn't have a way of telling the stories. We'd just be living them all the time. Yeah. And that's just provided me with a different insight into the leadership process.
Well, what I think you're talking about is, one of my favorite concepts that I learned in studying communication, of the idea of pluralistic truths, which, shows up in CMM and a number of other, but you can exist in this tension between my truth and your truth being two entirely different things and absolutely coexisting.
Right.
And again, that's an ask of people to lean into a more complex understanding of the world, Yeah. It's easier to say, this is the truth. This is the way we all function. This is what we all know to be true. But again, that's an oversimplification. There's so many different ways of being human. And even when I talk about effective communication, so many different ways to do that. When you talk about leadership, there's so many different ways to be an effective leader. There's not a one size fits all, quote unquote, capital T truth of the situation. I would love to kind of transition into the last thing that I love to talk about with my guests, which, is maybe an opportunity to kind of recap some of the things we already talked about. I just want to be using the CMM frame of a better social world. And I know that you've already, mentioned that in other conversations, people have already asked of you, well, how do you define better? But in this conversation, I want to use those same kind of terms and say, how do you define a better social world? And then a follow-up to that being, how do you feel like you're working towards that, maybe personally or professionally as an educator and with your work with the Clinton Foundation and the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program? Yeah,
that's such a great question. And it's a hard one to answer. This is a harder one for me to answer than trying to define communication and what the better social world is. Yeah. And sometimes I wonder, so for me, again, I feel personally this same kind of gravitational pull towards, a predictive model. Do we predefine what better means? What a better world was. Yeah.
We might not know what a better world is until we're in it, in a way.
Yeah. Or is another way of thinking about it, do we mindfully respond and react to the worlds that we're creating in our interactions with other people in a way that make them better?
Yeah. I think it's another both and, right?
Yes.
We're both leaving room for the better social world to emerge, and we are spending some time playing around with what we think it looks like.
Yeah. If there's any current participant or any of the alumni of Presidential Leadership Scholars listening to this, they'd be very disappointed if at this point I didn't say that one of my most frequent sayings in our PLS program is that the journey is the destination.
Yeah.
And I think when we talk about the better social world, which I think is what that scholar that when was pushing back with me about, but who gets to define what's better, is the point that he was really making, which is that we don't predefine what better is. The idea is that do we create the kinds of interaction frameworks that allow for people to actively engage in co-authoring the social worlds, and are we working actively towards making what it is we are creating to be of benefit to solve the problem that we're facing, to find ways of facing the challenges that we're facing, not defining an outcome that's out there somewhere that we're getting to, and then once we get there, we've succeeded.
Yep.
But rather to recognize that at every turn of the conversation, we have an opportunity to frame that in terms of the better social worlds that we're wanting to make. It doesn't eliminate the fact that we have, in many, many instances, we have very specific outcomes that we're working towards.
Mm-hmm.
We have objectives that we want to achieve. We have metrics that need to be met in some way or another.
Yeah.
The question of leadership is not, do we have those? Although sometimes part of leadership is creating those if they're not there. But the challenge of leadership then is, how do we structure our interactions with one another that will create a social world that is closer to achieving that objective, maybe in a way that we never would have anticipated if we didn't create the kind of frameworks we created for interaction. My first year at the Clinton School, our students did summer projects and capstone projects. And we had one of our students went out to a small town in eastern Arkansas in the Mississippi River Delta region of the state, extremely poor part of the state, went to this small community where the community had been engaged in dialogue about improving their city. And in fact, we had taken the whole class out there earlier with Kim and Barnett Pierce to conduct some of these conversations. She went back because she wanted to continue the conversation. And you always hear people say, when you get in those situations, you should ask, who hasn't been invited into the conversation that should have been? And what I told my students was, what you should ask is, who hasn't been invited into the conversation? Forget the who should have been part, because
right.
That suggests that
some people shouldn't.
That you're already imposing some sort of bias about who should be in the conversation. So she asked that question, and one of the responses we got is, we've never asked kids. And so she did her project with, I think they were fifth graders.
Wow.
In this small town. She spent time with them, and she basically asked them, when you think about this town when you're 21 years old, what's it like? And so they came up with all their ideas. And then I think what she did, she hired somebody where the kids created a kind of a picture of it. And it was going to be a mural on the, this is the vision that 10-year-olds in this town have.
Yeah.
Of what it's going to be like when they're 21 years old. And I remember somebody telling me, I think it was somebody from the town told me that they thought it was the first time in a long time that any adult had talked to a 10-year-old in that town with the expectation that they would still be there when they were 21 years old. Because the history of that town was when kids graduated high school, they left and they never came back.
Yeah.
And just the fact that she had that conversation with them, sort of changed everybody's idea about what a better social world is. Yeah. They never would have encountered on their own. And so from my perspective is, that's a great example of not defining what the outcome is in terms of, this is what this town should be like in 15 years now. How do we get there? Versus, we want it to be better. Let's engage people in conversations that along the way show us both what it is we want it to be and what it is we need to do to get it there, but is constantly allowing us to re-examine, as we learn more and we do more, the ways in which what we want it to be might change. And so I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, but history in this country has shown us time and time again that people fight to gain their rights, to a wide variety of things. And when they succeed in that, all that basically does is just, it advances us towards that goal. But generally, it's the great, heuristic value of conversation, the heuristic value of communication, that in answering the questions, we generate more questions. Yeah. And in achieving our rights in achieving our voting rights, it just opens up questions now about the nuances of that and the other ways in which things can happen. I mean, time and time and time again, that it's the journey that should be our focus. And so when in CMN, when we talk about looking at communication and not through it, in my mind, I always say I'm looking at it. I can, it's kind of translucent. I can see through it. I know where we're going. Yeah. But I'm not going to get so locked in on what that's supposed to be that I'm not going to allow this to change and modify and be constantly thinking about what are we making? How are we making it? How do we make it better? And part of that is the natural evolution and change of the end state that we're aspiring to. In leadership, it runs contrary to the way most people have been taught about, the leadership is, especially in today's society where I feel like we've come to this point where we think obstinance is leadership. Stubbornness is leadership. The stronger you are in digging your feet in and resisting any is the sign of strong leadership. Not allowing any deliberation about your ideas is a sign of strong leadership. And that is so focused on the destination and not the journey. Yep. That there's not much benefit to that.
Absolutely. I appreciate you kind of, wrapping up with this idea of that the journey is the destination, because it's contextualizing the rest of this conversation in a really cool way for me, because I'm kind of hearing when you say the journey is the destination is another way of saying communication for communication's sake, And the third one I'd add to that, which I think is, what I'm hearing you saying is a better world for a better social world's sake, or, the better social world is made through making a better social world. I don't know exactly the right wording for that, but in that same vein of we create a better social world in the trying to create a better social world, it emerges and it's its own reward in a way.
When you're in this line of work, you have a lot of occasions people come to you advice, about how to communicate. My students have done that over the years. And I've had friends and students, come to me where they're facing really, really critical decisions, career choices, getting married, whatever it may be. I mean, they're really sort of obvious, explicit bifurcating moments in their lives, right? And trying to decide. And I get a sense from people that oftentimes the way they approach those decisions is, I want to make the choice that's going to work, as opposed to making the choice and then making it work. Which is, when I hear you say communicating for communication's sake, that's what I take away from it. That's what resonates with me, is not that you make flippant decisions on those, but you do take into account all the things but that you are also always reminding yourself that when I make this decision, then the job becomes making that decision work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's going to require the same level of attention and interaction and mindfulness and reflection. The trap is thinking, oh, I've made the decision, so now let's see if it works, and sitting back. And oftentimes then when you do that, it doesn't. And people say, oh, I should have made a different choice. And it's like, no, maybe you should have worked a little harder at making the choice you made work.
Yeah. Well, you talk about those bifurcation points, and there's, you said, maybe there's some classic examples of big life choices a lot of people face. But again, like those smaller moments, it's like showing up in the small moments can be just as important as the big moments, or, enough small moments become the big moments.
It's like you've been in my classes. So when I would tell my students, the times you need to exercise leadership are usually the times you don't want to, because the moment is so big. Well, the corollary to that then is the time to practice. Is when the stakes aren't so high.
Because it matters then too, but
it does.
It's maybe easier. Try out some new choices in those small moments. Yeah.
And to reflect on the choices that you did make in the small moments.
I'm thinking of like an Olympian, like you wouldn't go try something out on the beam if you're a gymnast for the first time at the Olympics.
Right.
In front of the whole world. You'd practice that in your, own gym for a long time before that.
Yeah, and maybe not 4 feet off the ground, maybe 6 inches off the ground.
Yes.
I think about my wife and I used to engage in this hangry episode. So my wife and I have been married for 46 years. And early on, we used to have this hangry episode that we would do. Usually after a day of driving around, maybe we skipped lunch or whatever, it was getting time for dinner, and we were both really hungry. And it's one of these things where one of us would go, oh, I'm hungry. You want to go out to eat? Yeah. Where do you want to go? I don't care anywhere you want to go. And then, well, I don't care. Where do you want? No, you decide. No, you decide. And then somebody would say someplace, and then the next response was, no, I don't want it. Let's go get Chinese. No, I don't want Chinese.
Yeah.
And then this became so routine for us that we developed this rule in our relationship, which was, if we've gone back and forth like this and somebody suggests a place and the other person doesn't accept it, then that relieves the originator of any responsibilities for picking out where to go. So now it's all on you to decide.
That's funny.
So one time we're driving around and I say to my wife, it's getting late and we're both hungry. And I say, I'm getting hungry. You want to go out to eat? And she says, yeah. She says, where do you want to go? And I said, I don't care. Where do you want to go? And there's this pause and she looks at me and she says, we both know where this conversation is going to go. She just called it out, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
We know where this is going.
That's good meta communicating right there. Exactly.
And so let's not go there. And gave us a whole different perspective on exchange. But it was such in many, many ways, right? I mean, you would hope that in the course of marriage, the worst thing you ever had to deal with is trying to figure out where to go out to eat.
Yeah.
But in that moment, it was such a great learning because it relates to so many other things, that the way we talked about other things.
Absolutely.
You can sort of see that it's an exemplar for other interactions we have.
A good small moment of practice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And reflection. Yeah. Just that small moment of,
Mm-hmm. My boyfriend and I both grew up in families where maybe other members of our families were like overly accommodating. And so kind of by default, we were like the decision makers, I'm just going to have an opinion because no one else will. And so we both are very familiar with like decision fatigue. And so what we do when we're trying to decide where to go eat is say one person's going to say 3 options and then the other person's going to pick from that. So you both have a role in the picking.
Oh, that's awesome.
You don't have to throw one out and think that the other person is only saying that they'll go because you want to go. Because if you said the original 3 and I picked from that 3, I know you wanted that at least 33%. And that helps. And again, it applies to bigger things because then, we traveled together for 6 months after we graduated in May. And we were able to have bigger conversations about decision fatigue. When I was like, we are making plans every moment of every day for 6 months straight. And I'm able to say, hey, remember that conversation about picking a place to eat and the decision fatigue we both experience on something that small? I'm getting a little decision fatigued about where we're going to stay next and how we're going to spend our money and what country we're about to go to.
Right. Yeah.
And it's those small moments help you have language and help you practice for those bigger moments.
That's a great example. That's awesome.
Yeah. It's helpful. It works. It works. And I share it with anyone I can. Yeah.
That's like we had friends that she had 2 boys close in age, and they would fight over like the last piece of cake or whatever.
Yeah.
And they would always ask her to cut it evenly. And her response, and I'm sure other people have come up with this because she was the first person I ever heard do this. Her response was she'd give the knife to one of them, say, you cut it into 2 pieces and your brother gets to pick the first piece.
Yeah, that's good.
And she would say, you've never seen a more meticulous assessment of slicing a piece of cake.
So good. That's so
great?
Good.
Yeah. Yep. But that's the same deal. Then you think I can see extending that into bigger issues. Yeah.
It's collaboration.
It is.
It's all full circle.
That's great.
That's amazing. Great. Wow. Well, Mike, I really appreciate your time today and all of your insights. I feel like this has been a really rich conversation for me. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Abbie. I've enjoyed it too. It's been a lot of fun, and I appreciate the invitation.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Mike. At the end of each episode, I like to offer some questions to reflect on, which act as a next turn so the conversation doesn't stop when the episode does. You may have noticed that in general, I've been trying to pull back on this a little bit and just ask one question, because even one really good question can provide a lot of opportunities for reflection. But when I originally posted this conversation, it was 2 episodes and each had 3 reflection questions. So I've condensed that a little bit today, but we've still got 3, I think, really good questions for reflection. And you can find these in the show notes. So the questions I'm having us reflect on today are: how do we, as a community of individuals with individual experiences, thoughts, and feelings, come together to create shared meaning? And How has our understanding of communication evolved to more accurately encompass the complexities and nuances of human relationships? And finally, whether or not we consider ourselves creative or leaders, how can we still find ways to create and to lead? I think it'll be abundantly clear where these reflection questions emerge out of today's conversation, and I hope you'll take some time reflecting on them. You're welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections as well as any of your own questions or ideas. You can do that through email, the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube, or by commenting on the CMM Institute Substack under this podcast episode. That's a great place to be in dialogue. And links to all those places are in the show notes to make it easy for you to access. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. Other great ways to keep dialogue alive is to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode, and like I mentioned at the very top of the episode, take part in that survey. I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to equip us to engage in better communication so that, as a result, we might create better social worlds. Other initiatives include the upcoming Cosmo-Parenting podcast, which I have been honored to participate in and facilitate. That'll be coming out beginning in January 2025, but you can already go over to the Cosmo-Parenting Substack and subscribe so you get those right in your inbox. A link to that is in the show notes. And the other initiative I'll point you toward is our CMM Institute Fellows. We have an upcoming presentation on December 11th where all of this year's fellows are going to present and we'll have dialogue about their projects. So you can register for that also at a link that is in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.